Hey guys, it is Mike with the Come the Night. Welcome back to another reaction video. Today we are taking a look at a video by a YouTuber called Circle of Tone. Circle of Tone has a number of complaints against modern metal and specifically calls out progressive metal on a number of points. This is my response to his video.
I'm going to be called an elitist.
You elitist.
I'm going to be called narrow-minded.
You narrow-minded prick. God, I'm starting to sound like my own comment section.
Don't go easy in the comments. Give it to me. I can take it. I'm a big boy.
Yeah, you are. And I like them big.
Let's talk about the guitars first off, okay? They use one microphone, an SM57. They use one speaker, a Vintage 30, on every damn song, on every album.
You just described 90% of the rock guitars ever recorded. At least since the Vintage 30s have been a thing. Yes, there are different methods of cultivating and capturing your tone, but this is kind of a proven method over time. That's not to say there isn't room for experimentation. Most of the players that I love use a combination of microphones and typically Vintage 30s. And yes, I know later in the video you say that the 57 is typically their core sound, and that's true, but there's definitely something to it as far as cutting through the mix. Petrucci, Opeth, Dave Grohl, fantastic tone. And the core of that tone is typically a 57 and a V30. So I guess the better question is, what's your alternative?
Because your frequency, your upper mid spike, is grating in my ear like an ice pick on every damn album that's come out since 1995.
And again, that's because it's ideal for cutting through the mix. It accentuates the guitar's core frequencies. If you want to experiment with it, by all means, go for it, and best of luck to you. But if it ain't broke...
So they're using the same gear, okay? They're using, does this sound familiar? A 5150 style or a Recto style, boosted of course with a tube screamer, a Maxon of course, with a Mesa Boogie oversized cabinet with Vintage 30s. Does that sound familiar? Or a Marshall, with boosted of course with a Maxon overdrive.
Okay, there's a number of things I want to address here. First, what makes a genre? Composition is a large part of that, yes, but tone is also an enormous part of that. As you say later in your video, tone informs the techniques that a musician will use, and this is another huge part of what makes a genre, is the techniques. From the sound of the beginning of this video, it sounds like you're more just sick of modern metal and not so much that modern metal sucks. I do have my gripes with metal for sure, but trying to pick out the core tone of metal guitars and saying that that's an issue, I don't know, it just comes off like you're trying to find things to bitch about, but later in the video, I understand a little more where you're coming from. Secondly, yes, many players in metal do utilize this signal chain, but they'll use different brands, and Lord knows they put knobs on those things for a reason, so you could change the way they sound. If you compare James Hetfield to Michael Ackerfeld to Tosin Abasi, you're going to get three very distinct tones that basically have the same equipment, same signal chain, just a little bit different. But you are very much able to tell the difference between those three tones. And also, a large part of what makes a guitar tone is the guitar itself, the pickups, which I think you talk about later, but I don't know. The types of pickups that you referenced, I don't know a whole lot of people that are using them and the stuff that I listen to. But even just the material that the thing's made out of goes a long way to informing the tone.
I put air quotes in progressive metal. If it's progressive, why are there 100 or more edits on the guitars that I see on mixes of progressive bands? Why can't they dampen strings? Why does everything have to be chopped up? And why can't it all be done in one or two takes? Is progressive needing a metronome and a MIDI map put your entire mix to make sure it's in time? Is that progressive? I thought progressive was having a good internal clock, a band playing and recording the bones of the band live, and then adding solos, adding the extra guitar, adding the vocals. That's dead now. Now everyone's cheating.
A few points of clarity here. I'm sure you're familiar with red light syndrome. Once you're recording, you mindfuck yourself into making mistakes. Everyone is guilty of this. If you haven't yet, check out the first episode of my podcast. We discuss it there. 2, sometimes you can't get everyone in the studio at the same time, and a full band performance isn't able to happen. 3, yes, progressive typically implies that you have a strong mastery of some difficult advanced techniques, but definitely not always. Not only that, but trying to say that, oh, why do you need a metronome if you're progressive? I mean, let's take it a step further. Why do you need a metronome if you're a musician? I think you do make a point, something to that effect later in the video. But I digress. Opeth is super proggy, and aside from a few solos on a couple of albums, there is nothing on that record guitar-wise that an intermediate guitar player couldn't handle. Progressive does not have to be technically complicated or amazing or necessarily push boundaries in that way. It does need to try and drive the genre forward, and it does need to break some conventions. Having said all of that, I do agree with you to an extent. If you are in a touring band, you should be able to knock out a track recorded straight through, or maybe 1 to 3 takes, depending on if there's breaks for clean parts or whatever. And you should be able to do those uncut. Maybe you have to move like a note here or there, or like one section that was played a little bit ahead of the beat. But other than that, you should be able to knock that out if you're playing this on a regular basis. Any small edits that you would do is literally just for the interest of time. It makes more sense to move a note slightly than it does to re-record the entire track if everything else is perfect. However, most prog does not have a live sound or feel. I mean, if you want to take it back to Pink Floyd, they kept that stuff in an extremely controlled and almost sterile environment, and that's a very prominent complaint about the genre. Also, in my case, I write by recording. I edit my mistakes, change things up, and then learn it live. Now, that's how I write, and there are plenty of times I go back and I learn the part so that I can record it straight through so that it has more of an organic feeling. But all in all, for Ryan and I, with the type of stuff that we write, it saves a lot of time. And not only that, we don't have a space that we can sit down and record in or practice in. And any spaces that we could find cost an arm and a leg in Nashville, so it saves a ton of money.
What's so progressive about everybody using Strymons for clean intros? Nobody has heard anything like this. This is so progressive.
Agreed. I don't know why people have such a boner for that effect on their clean guitars. It's really a cliche by now.
Everybody's copying each other. That's not progressive. Progressive metal is dead. I've listened to all these off the wall bands, and they all sound the same.
Okay, he does have some legit complaints here. Prog is getting caught up its own ass quite a bit nowadays. However, there is always a certain amount of derivation when writing music. Some bands are more eclectic in their derivation, others much more direct. I don't see this as inherently bad, and I think should be taken on a case-by-case basis. Second point, prog metal is not dead. It's alive more now than possibly ever. In the last 10 to 15 years, we've seen an extreme amount of new genres and new sounds pop up from the prog scene that have informed so many other subgenres of metal. I mean, it's insane. Some of them have literally been changing the game. That's why you see so many people trying to emulate it, because they changed the game. Progression takes many small steps over a long period of time to occur. What you're more referring to is more of a revolution. It's rare that you can see someone step completely outside of the box successfully. And I think part of the issue that you're referring to here is the fact that we classify a genre of metal or a genre of rock as prog. It is a necessary evil. Prog has so many different sounds that qualify. You can't just listen to Dream Theater and go, okay, all prog sounds like this. And for younger players who aren't as well listened or aren't really familiar with the term, they can listen to that and say, I want to sound exactly like that because that's so cool. And they'll call it prog when they're really just trying to be more derivative. And I agree there is something about that that's not really helping, but I don't necessarily think it's the worst thing ever. I mean, granted, it does lead to a lot more of unoriginal music, if you will. Either way, long story short, just give it some time, dude. You'll definitely be surprised. Or find some more shit to complain about. Did we just become best friends?
Let's start with the drums. Heavy metal is supposed to be loud and obnoxious and in your face, right? Why is everybody allowing drums to cheat? Or you might not know this, but your favorite band snapped to a MIDI grid, computerized grid, and every hit that he does is picked up by a sensor. And that sensor does not use the actual drum sound. At least 50% of that sound is going to be a sample. So you're listening to drum machines, not drummers.
Again, he does have some legit gripes here. However, this definitely is not every metal band. And yes, all of the guys who snap themselves to a MIDI with like Beat Detective and then sound replace everything get on my damn nerves. Kind of defeats the purpose of having a drummer. Mixing in samples into the recorded performance, that being the recorded performance is still there, uncut and heard, you're just layering it with some more samples to help shape the color, totally fine by me. It's just a production technique that helps shape the tone. The performance is still there.
So you're listening to drum machines programmed by a drummer, and they say, but he still has to hit the notes. That's right, but tap, tap, tap. They get this ridiculous speed by really lightly tapping and lightly hitting the bass drum, and then they use these samples to make it sound like Thor's hammer is hitting that drum when it's not. It's a little chopstick.
I 100% agree with him at this point. And what's even more egregious, some of these pricks do it live. You go to a live show, you see this ridiculously fast drumming, and you're like, oh my God, he's so amazing. And then you go and talk to him after show like, dude, how do you do that? He's not going to tell you the truth. And if he does tell you the truth, your opinion of his playing skills just dropped significantly. That's what we call being fake. Or at least if he admits to it openly, it's not as impressive. There's an argument to be made that it's still musical and really not that big of a deal. But at the end of the day, you would be removing another human factor from the equation. How long until it's all fake? And then at that point, what's the point of it? Where's the meaning to be found in this?
Now let's get to vocals. I'm not going to go after the emo metal. I'm not going after the low-hanging fruit, the easy stuff.
God, part of me wishes you did, man.
I'm going after the hardcore, the grindcore guys.
Oh, so the other low-hanging fruit. Please go on.
You all sound the same. You're using these vocal techniques, using fry vocals, right? Or inward screaming. And when you do that, you lose the character of your voice. It's hard to do pterodactyl screams and sound like yourself. Your pterodactyl scream is going to sound almost identical to another singer's pterodactyl scream.
Agreed. There definitely is a lot of unique characteristic that gets lost when you start employing some of these techniques. However, because there's still differences in the shapes of each person's vocal box, I mean, you still get some of that character going back down. It still sounds significantly different. Some can definitely be distinguished more than others.
I'm talking about the singers with the inward breathing, the pterodactyl screams, the pig squeals. I'm not banging on them because it is really hard what they do. That technique takes a lot, and there's a lot of different bloody techniques out there, that these kids do, but it takes your individuality away.
I think in tandem with what he's talking about here, it's just so overdone. Yeah, it was cool. The first 3,000 bands I heard it from. I can enjoy it when done tastefully, but I find most growl and scream vocals to be pretty drab. Just the aesthetic of doing the growls or the screams, there's not a whole lot of room for dynamic there. And by dynamic, I mean mostly emotional dynamic. You're not going to be able to make a growl that sounds happy or a growl that sounds inquisitive. It's just a growl that sounds either painful or mad or brutal. All kind of in the same wheelhouse. You can't move out of this little direction here.
Our music is on rails. If we get rid of the metronome, if we get that initial take like they used to do in the 80s, in the 70s, the actual band playing where you had to section coding them off, but actually to get your takes there. But what does that take? That takes money, that takes manpower, that takes effort, that takes obsession, and it's hard.
He's right to an extent. Yes, it is hard, and yes, it is way more real, but it is also way more expensive. If you can do that, more power to you. The real issue at the end of the day here is, can you reproduce it live? If you can do individual tracking to a metronome and make it sound really, really tight, and then go ahead and reproduce that live when people see you, like just the same as out of the studio, i.e. periphery, I see zero problem with that.
I mean, I am guilty of it myself. My last album was all to a click track, but I made sure that because I'm a thrash guy, I could not put out a thrash album with fake drums. I refused to.
In all seriousness, mad respect, my dude.
In guitars, which has been so overstated on forums, in recording forums, mids in guitars. Now it's got to such a point where we're using a mid-focused microphone, we're using a mid-focused vintage 30, we're having mid-focused pickups, we have, well, crank the mids, you know, God forbid you sound like Metallica back in the day, which was fucking amazing, right?
I highly disagree with this point. To a point, yes, you do want your metal guitar slightly scooped because there already is so much brang, if you will, coming out of the mid to high mids. But if you scoop too much, you're losing a pretty important part of your full spectrum. I will concede there is a such thing as too much mids too often. However, the tone on Justice I have grown to dislike quite a bit. It kind of sounds like crap to me.
What's wrong with treble? What's wrong with relaxed mids and huge bottom end?
Technically, nothing. You can get a lot of cool tones that way. It's just most times it sounds pretty unnatural. That, and most times I find overly boosted treble through distortion to be grating on my ears.
Because metal is supposed to be loud and nasty, and now you got all these rules. Like you got to use mids. Fuck the rules, dude. You got to be yourself.
I agree. Breaking the rules is totally okay and can really help you find a unique sound. But you risk going through needless trial and error to essentially reinvent the wheel. I find it helpful for me to try and sound like multiple people that I like at once. So that way I'm kind of obeying some rules, but then I'm forced to break others. At least that's what I try to do. I don't know how successful I am at it. And in its own way will help you create a more unique sound.
If you were the guy like me, the guy that does all the recording, you're the mastermind, you write the songs, you get the musicians in, try and find another mastermind who's a drummer, who's on your level, is the guy that creates everything, or the bass player. Bands have become one band leader, one guy who runs the show, and then a couple of other hired guns to flesh everything out. We need to get away from that. That you don't. If you need people arguing with you, that could be better. That is shit. You know, people competing, you know, like the Beatles back in the day.
I agree with this for the most part. I think it is helpful to have a singular vision that you are trying to achieve, both for time factor and just for focus. However, it is extremely helpful collaborating and bringing additional influences into the music. It'll bring more depth and originality to the music, as well as helping to cultivate a more individual voice. Ryan and I do this, and I am the ultimate gatekeeper. I give him a lot of freedom to write what he feels, and there are times where he writes a part, and then I go back and change my part because his writing informed my writing. His influence in our writing process has definitely elevated our music.
Kirk Hammett flipped burgers for 2 years, almost 2 years, to buy his Gibson and his Marshall. You know, it keeps dedication, guys. Borrow your uncle's old amp, you know, go to your friend's basement and set up camp there, you know, get with like-minded people and get your resources together and start creating properly, making a noise wherever you can. You know, stop making excuses. Don't say, oh, I can only afford this or that or the other. If you're passionate about this, you know, you got to sink some money and some time and some love into it.
I totally agree. In the spirit of that, I am using a Line 6 Helix for my recordings. It's not because it's my go-to, it is because it is the best decision I can make for myself in my current situation. I am fortunate enough to have a tube amp that's fantastic in my possession, but I do not currently use it to record. Ryan and I are working towards getting a space for us to practice and record in regularly. However, like our friend said, that takes time and effort. But I'm not going to let time stand in the way of me making music right now.
Bass guitar. What has happened to bass guitar in metal? It's disappeared. It's such an afterthought. Now, believe it or not, most engineers, these are professional guys too. These are the big boys. They will just DI a bass track and then they'll hit it with disgusting VST distortion, and there's this weird technique that they use which makes it sound like an ice pick in your ear, but it has a huge frequency range which is satisfying in the mix, but you don't hear the bass, but it makes the whole mix sound 3D.
I am mostly in agreement with this. Many metal bands fall into the bass will follow the guitar trap, and this leads to them mixing it this way. It becomes an extension of the guitar tone instead of being its own instrument. Can be cool, but really overused.
Say this is the whole guitar range, okay? They'll take out the bass and they'll take out the air, and they might even push the mids. Mids. Why? Because they want the bass to sit here and then the bass drum to sit just below that.
Agreed. I used to do that a lot in mixing, and I'm trying to get further away from that progressively and having some success. Most of the guys that I listen to whose production I love have a lot of bandwidth in all of the instruments. Again, sounds more natural.
People in the music industry aren't that smart, believe it or not. A lot of these producers aren't that smart, and they will follow the leader. So we have to tell them, stop with this bullshit. Start signing bands who can actually play their instruments together like a band. Who would have thought of that? And maybe we can make a difference and bring back 80s speed metal.
A lot of these guys are actually really smart. The issue is they're adverse to risk, which I also agree is a huge problem. I too want to punch an enormous hole in the establishment music industry in more ways than one. Let's bring the creativity back to music and worry less about what's going to sell. And this is a great place to wrap this up. I have obviously disagreed with a number of your points and don't fully follow you down your logical progression. However, I do agree with the core sentiments of your points here, and I think that your heart and your mind are absolutely in the right place and right direction. At the end of the day, I see us on the same side here. As a matter of fact, I would love to discuss this with you in more detail in a non-hostile environment. This is an open invitation for you, Circle of Tone. If you would like to discuss further, I have a podcast, and you are super welcome to come onto this show. I think you would be a fantastic guest. I think we would have a great discussion, and I think we could actually learn a thing or two from each other. Those are my thoughts. Please let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you like this video, or if you want to help me make better videos, please pledge to me every month on Patreon. If you can't do a rolling pledge, you can tip me one time on PayPal. You can also follow me on Facebook and Twitter at Become the Night. Thank you guys so much for watching. See you in the next video. Rock on!